All right, welcome back. This time moving on to chapter 16. So as you saw already, hopefully, there wasn't really anything I could add to chapter 15. There was a lot of diagrams. Basically, it was how to perform various strength training exercises. There was some stuff on there about grips, like open versus closed and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, not a ton that I could have really added to it, so I didn't make a lecture for chapter 15. Chapter 16 is similar. There's not a ton I can add to chapter 16 either. It is largely diagrams as well, discussions of how to perform a variety of non-traditional training exercises or alternative training exercises. So when I think about alternative methods for resistance training, I think about strongman training because that's kind of where my head's at. But this chapter also touches on other things like kettlebells, body weight training, bands, and I think a couple other things. So there are some things that I can add to what's covered in the book, and so we'll do that here. So the general guidelines that are laid out in this textbook chapter, it basically talks about how the guidelines are pretty similar to what we would use with regular resistance training. So by that I mean, your typical barbell dumbbell training. You would progress them similarly, especially if we're thinking about things like strongman implements or kettlebell training. The periodization would be pretty similar with these alternative methods to what we would see with your standard barbell training. The same kind of safety advice applies. You want to have your athletes, for most of these are ground-based exercises, so you're going to be, feet shoulder width apart, maybe a little bit wider than that. You're going to have a nice flat back, chest up, head up, those kinds of things. So everything is pretty similar with this kind of training to what you're going to see in the use of barbells for, like I said, the standard lifts like squat, bench, deadlift, or the Olympic lifts. Other things, breathing. So we haven't talked about that yet. So typically you're going to want to breathe in during the eccentric phase and then breathe out during the concentric phase. So if we're doing something like a dumbbell press, so like a bench press but using dumbbells, when you are supine on the bench, if the dumbbells are at arm's length out, over your chest, as you bring the weights down to your chest, you're going to breathe in and then breathe out during the concentric phase when you're lifting the weights back to arm's length. One of the things they talk about too is to breathe through the sticking points. If you're using fairly heavy dumbbells and you kind of get caught in that changeover from pecs to triceps in the middle of the motion, then you would breathe out a little bit more during that phase of the motion. So the key takeaway there, breathe in during the eccentric phase, out during the concentric phase. One of the things that I appreciate that they talk about, oftentimes you'll hear or read things about like not holding your breath while you lift, but I think that is unrealistic, especially if you're lifting really heavy weights. So coming from somebody who has, how I got into all of this stuff was through competitive powerlifting. Like if you're, doing a really heavy squat, the first thing that powerlifters do is to, once they've taken the weight out of the rack and they're getting ready to squat, they'll take a big deep breath in and hold it and then go. And the reason that you're doing that is to stabilize your spine. And so the number of times that I've been told by like various coaches who are typically sport coaches, baseball, basketball, etc., like not to do that, it was like, well, that's not really realistic because then you're going to end up with an unstable spine and potentially a back injury, and nobody wants that. Now, that there is some caution to that. So, there's some pretty funny videos you can find on YouTube of people like starting holding their breath like way too early. There's a particularly funny one I've seen of a powerlifter who he's going up for a deadlift, and essentially as soon as he gets onto the platform, he holds his breath. And then he reaches down and grabs the bar and gets set up, and then eventually he stands up and he passes out after he stands up. But the problem was that he should have gotten, get down, grab the bar, get set up, then take a deep breath and hold it, and then immediately lift. And that'll help eliminate some of that low blood pressure, or not really low blood pressure. The Valsalva maneuver does limit venous return, so it will have an effect on blood pressure, but during those kinds of lifts, blood pressure rises anyway because of the peripheral resistance. So anyway, it'll eliminate that temporary low oxygenation of the brain because of the breath holding, and so that feeling of dizziness or that you're going to black out, you want to minimize the amount of time that you hold your breath. But all that said, this book recommends with heavy loads, so greater than 80% of your 1 rep max, that the Valsalva maneuver is useful because it does maintain spinal stability. So, if you're doing heavy deadlifts, if you're doing heavy squats, cleans, etc., you are going to hold your breath some during those lifts to stabilize your spine. All right, so the first of the alternative training methods is body weight training. So these are calisthenics is kind of a way to think about them. So a lot of the stuff that we all grew up doing in PE class, so push-ups, mountain climbers, not many of us did bodyweight squats, but those would fall under this category: bodyweight squats, lunges, bridges, planks, that kind of stuff, right? So all that is bodyweight training. So that is obviously, in terms of the resistance, that's specific to your size. That's your anthropometrics. Typically, they're closed chain exercises, meaning that the distal aspect of the extremity is fixed to the ground. So like a bodyweight squat, your feet are fixed to the ground, so that's closed chain. Push-up, your hands are fixed to the ground, that's closed chain. As opposed to like an open chain exercise would be, rather than doing a push-up, a dumbbell press. And so each of those dumbbells is moving independently. They're not attached to anything, so there's a lot more stabilization that has to happen in a dumbbell press, at least at the shoulder, than we would get with a push-up. Typically, those types of exercises strengthen several muscle groups at once. So going back to the push-up, so if you're doing a push-up, not only is that going to strengthen, your horizontal adductors of the shoulder, your elbow extensors, but also your core musculature as you're trying to maintain a nice neutral pelvis throughout the range of motion. So we get strengthening of the upper body, but also some strengthening of the core musculature, the rectus abdominis, the obliques, transverse abdominis, etc. Develop strength relative to your body weight. So one of the good things about body weight exercises is they help you to handle your own body weight more effectively, which part of agility, being able to stop and change direction, is being able to handle your body weight. And so potentially body weight exercises would be really helpful for that. They improve your body control, and they're low cost. You don't need anything. You just string them together. We're going to do a circuit from push-ups to lunges to squats to planks, and you can do a variety of different things using that. Dips, using some chairs. So it is, having just come out of the pandemic, I remember seeing lots and lots of exercise programs that were bodyweight type training programs. It was, you're stuck in your house all day, you don't have equipment, in part because all of the equipment is on back order. So what can you do to exercise? Here's this bodyweight training program you can do. So we've seen a lot of that lately. Core stuff. So one of the things that I would mention is that oftentimes when people refer to the core, so if they say, I'm going to go do some core training, what they really mean is they're going to work their rectus abdominis and maybe their obliques, right? And typically when people talk about core training, certainly outside of an athletic context, they're usually talking about the aesthetics. Basically, they want to be able to see their abs and have a, let's go with toned midsection, right? But the core is more than rectus abdominis and the obliques. It also includes transverse abdominis. Technically, it includes the pelvic floor. So the core is much more expansive than that. It also includes the low back musculature. So the way that they describe the core in this textbook is that it includes any muscle that originates on the axial skeleton. So remember that your axial skeleton includes the skull, spine, and ribs. So basically any muscle that originates from the spine or the ribs for our purposes. So thinking back to structure 201, we talked about muscles like iliopsoas or rectus femoris. So those are leg muscles, but they originate in or on the axial skeleton, either on the pelvis or on the low back. And so as a result, those would be grouped as core muscles as well. So just something to be aware of, that when we talk about, at least in a strength and conditioning sense, when we talk about the core, we're talking about much more than rectus abdominis and the obliques. The idea for athletes is that by strengthening the core, one of the things that athletes have to do in a variety of their motions is essentially momentum transfer. Momentum may not be exactly the best word there, but you have to transfer torques from the lower body to the upper body. So for example, most throwing or serving type motions, so think of a baseball pitcher, a football quarterback, softball player. As they throw, they're going to step, rotate their trunk, and then externally rotate the shoulder, right? So what they're doing then is they're transferring forces from their lower body. They're using that step to generate some momentum on the ball transferring that force generated by the lower body through the core into the upper body so that they can throw the ball with a greater velocity. So oftentimes if you're around like baseball pitchers, for example, they're really into, or they tend to be really into lower body training, tend to be really into like squats and leg press and that kind of stuff. For example, Nolan Ryan, Hall of Fame pitcher, was famous for how dedicated he was to leg pressing. Like, he was adamant about the importance of having a strong lower body in order to keep his fastball over 100 miles an hour. So the idea with core training then is that we're able to transmit that strength that's generated from the lower body up to the upper body. And if your core is weak, it's not going to be as effective at doing that. So that's why, as an athlete, we would want to do that. So for this lady doing her complicated exercise where she's doing got one hand on the upside down Bosu, and then she's also doing a row there. So if she were a runner or a volleyball player, etc., again, the idea there is that she's able to stabilize and then generate some torques in the upper body, so glenohumeral extension, at the same time that she's stabilizing her pelvis and her abdominal musculature. Isolation exercises, as they pertain to the core, or where we're just working the core muscles in isolation, just working them by themselves. So that's why I have this guy doing a side plank. So he's just working the lateral core muscles there. So these are things like planks and all the various iterations thereof. So, prone planks, supine planks, side planks, but also things like crunches, on a physio ball, or sit-ups, those kinds of things. All of those are isolation exercises. And they are good for engaging the core musculature, but as the textbook points out, they're not the most effective at engaging the core musculature in a pattern that we're going to use in sports. So if you do a whole bunch of like planks and stuff, the reason that those really became popular is because of research on low back injuries, and that we engage muscles like transverse abdominis and the multifidi, which are spine stabilizers, deep spine stabilizers, and that we engage those muscles before we do a variety of things. You got to stabilize the spine first, right? And so the idea was that, well, we can do these kinds of isolation exercises, these kinds of planks, to engage those stabilizers. Thus, we'll have a more stable core. Thus, we'll be able to throw the ball harder, or drive the golf ball farther, whatever it is that the person's looking to do. But there's not a lot of evidence that working your core musculature in this way transfers over to sport performance. One, because these are generally isometric contractions, so that guy is just going to hold that for 45 seconds or 60 seconds, whatever. But most of the things that we do in sports are not isometric contractions of the core musculature. They're really powerful, trunk rotations. And so doing these isolation exercises may be effective at reducing low back pain, for example, but may not be the most effective at increasing throwing velocity or increasing serving velocity, those kinds of things. So those, a better alternative might be to do something like wood choppers. And so in doing that, you're in a similar position to the throw, and you're engaging not only the core musculature, but also the upper body musculature in a relatively similar fashion to what we would see during a throwing motion. So these are good, but if you're looking to enhance sport performance, they might not be worth your time, unless they have low back pain. In terms of machines versus free weights, obviously using machines, so let's say a chest press machine versus doing a dumbbell press, machines are going to engage the core less because you are very stabilized on a machine. Because really one of the selling points of resistance training machines is that anybody can use them, right? You don't have to be that coordinated. You don't really have to learn very much. You just have to get on there, do what the diagram says, and push or pull or whatever the machine does, right? And so they don't engage core musculature really, and it's kind of by design, because they're trying to just focus and isolate certain parts of the body and make themselves, usable for your more inexperienced trainees. So free weights then obviously engage the core musculature more. And so especially if you're doing something like that lady's doing some renegade rows, those engage the core musculature pretty significantly, as one would expect. What about instability devices? This book is also pretty down on instability devices. They started with, or in a rehab context, so in physical therapy and athletic training. The idea behind the instability devices is that their original use was let's say after somebody sprained an ankle, you might use an AirX pad like this blue one that this guy is doing an RDL on. And the idea there is that, so after I've sprained my ankle, typical lateral ankle sprain, I have stretched out the ligaments on the lateral aspect of the ankle, I've stretched out the joint capsule, and I've damaged the perineal muscle, so some of the muscles on the lateral aspect of the lower leg. And so by damaging all those structures, each of them gives less feedback to the brain about where the ankle is in space. And so what we're trying to do then by putting an athlete on an AirX pad after they've rehabbed for a little while, but before they return to play, is to get them to try to relearn how to sense where the ankle is in space. So by putting them in this unstable environment, they're going to sort of retune the brain to understanding where their ankle is in space. And even more so, if we have them do it, initially you'll have them hold that position 2 feet, 1 foot. You may do 1 foot in front of the other. And then eventually you're going to work your way up to having them do it with their eyes closed. And so the idea there is that we reduce that visual feedback so that the brain really has to make use of that proprioceptive feedback coming from the muscles and the joint capsule and the ligaments, etc. But then in putting them on those unstable surfaces, they're obviously going to have to stabilize not only the ankle, but also the knee, the hip, and the low back. And so a lot of, strength and conditioning coaches, or strength and conditioning professionals, as the book always refers to them, a lot of strength and conditioning professionals saw that and said, okay, well, if having a stable core is really important in terms of being able to transfer force from the lower body to the upper body and vice versa, then we should use these kinds of unstable things, because if you do an exercise on those, you have to stabilize agonist and antagonist muscle groups simultaneously throughout the lower body, but also throughout the core. And then potentially that should lead to greater transference of forces from the lower body to the upper body. Doesn't really seem to work that way. So you do certainly engage the core musculature more during these exercises, but there's not a lot of evidence that that engagement, again, transfers over to an actual sporting movement. And similarly, if you're doing resistance training exercises on these things, you're not going to be able to use as much weight because you're in an unstable environment. And so with highly trained athletes, that may be less effective than actually just training with heavier weights. So just something to consider there. I remember when I was interning in minor league baseball almost 20 years ago now, this was really in vogue. There was, you saw unstable stuff everywhere, and some of the other teams that would come into our stadium, I'd see, some of the training that they would do and talk to their strength coaches. And so some of the other teams were huge on unstable training, and so they'd have their pitchers, on these AirX pads all the time, where they're doing their pitching motion or doing their windup on these AirX pads. And so I was asking our minor league strength and conditioning coordinator what he thought about that. And so he looked at me and he was like, I don't know, pitching mound itself seems pretty stable. Not really sure why we'd practice in an unstable environment. And I was like, okay, that's a good rationale, I think. And so basically his argument was that, if you're teaching them this other motor pattern that they're not really going to use. So they're getting really good at stabilizing their ankle in this unstable environment, but the pitching mound that they're on all the time isn't going to move on them. So why would we spend a bunch of time practicing that, was kind of his argument. And that I think is a pretty good argument, really. But certainly there are some reasons you would use this stuff, but primarily personally, I would keep it to either a rehab environment or a prehab environment. If you're trying to prevent injuries, that's where this stuff would be useful. All right, so most of the types of resistance training we're going to see are constant external resistance. So, whatever weight she's got on there, let's call that, 95. I'm assuming those are 25-pound bumpers. That's 95 at the bottom of the squats, 95 at the top of the squat, right? So that's the most common method of employing resistance that we see, is just whatever you're lifting. But there are ways to manipulate that. We've talked about accommodating resistance before in the context of exercise machines. So again, these are the original Nautilus machines, the ones that the guy who created them was a guy named Arthur Jones. And Arthur Jones's sales pitch was related to the muscle's length tension curve, which was that at different points in the range of motion, the muscle is able to exert more or less force. And so to accommodate that, we should take weight off at certain parts of the range of motion and add weight at other parts. And so that's why you get the shape, the Nautilus, the shell shape here, to the cam is because this rope or cable is going to go around the cam, and that is going to alter the resistance offered by the weight stack at different points in the range of motion. And his argument or his sales pitch was that because you were able to maximally challenge the muscle throughout the entire range of motion, all you needed to do was one set to failure. And so there are these whole like Nautilus clubs in the 80s where it was just this circuit of Nautilus machines where you would just do one maximal set on a leg press, for example, one maximal set on a lat pull down, et cetera, and you do like 12 or 15 exercises, and that was it. But with this, that's probably not as beneficial as doing traditional resistance training. But one of the ways to add a wrinkle to the constant external load is to add variable resistance. So this can be accomplished by using bands or chains. So this guy's doing a banded deadlift. The idea there is that we are the strongest at the top part of that lift, right? So if you're doing a deadlift, the hardest part is getting that bar moving off the ground, breaking its inertia or changing its inertia, getting the bar moving, and then especially once you get it over the knees, you're going to get quite a bit stronger. It's easier to lock out quite a bit more weight than you can actually get off the ground. And so what the bands are going to do there is that as he stands up, the bands are going to get more and more stretched out, and so they're going to offer increasing resistance as he gets closer to the top of the lift. So that's the idea there, is that when you're at the bottom of the lift, when you're at your weakest point, the bands aren't really offering any resistance. When you're at the top of the lift and at the strongest point, the bands are offering the most resistance. And you see the same thing whether you're using bands on or chains on squats or bench press or any of those other kinds of lifts. That's the idea behind all of them. So like I said, you can also use chains. There's a variety of different sizes of chains. You can go to Home Depot and buy some, and they'll cut them for you if you wanted to do that. This stuff is primarily used by powerlifters. You can use it with athletes. I mean, certainly I've seen more sport-oriented training facilities that have a lot of chains, and that's cool. So with athletes, one of the things that you could use this for is it is probably useful in helping to increase rate of force development and thus like vertical jump, because as the weight gets heavier, you sort of get used to accelerating as you're coming up out of the squat, and so then that would probably transfer to something like a vertical jump where you're increasing your force development as you're increasing hip and knee extension, for example. So in order to determine the resistance, it does take a little bit of effort, though. You have to weigh the chains and then figure out lengths and all that kind of stuff. But there are some tables in the book that are helpful with that, and there are also some tables on how to determine the resistance imposed by different color bands, and then how far they've been stretched out. And there's the instructions for how you would use chains. So one of the things about chains and bands is that they offer a little bit of proprioceptive challenge as well. So the chains will swing a little bit, or they can, and so it depends on how you move. And so that can offer some more of a balance requirement for your athletes. So maybe that's something you're going for. And then you can use the bands to like pull different directions. So maybe you want the bands to pull the weight forward or backward or whatever it is that you want. You can use the bands on the athletes themselves. They can pull their hips backwards, whatever it is you want to do with them. Are different ways to add wrinkles to the exercises that you're having your athletes do. One of the things that's worth noting here is that two bands that are the same, using green bands on both sides, there may be a decent difference between the two, and so maybe it's pulling harder on the right side than the left side. Just something to be aware of. If the athlete mentions that they feel off balance, the bands might be a little bit different. All right, strongman stuff. Woo! All right, so strongman stuff. The book talks about 3 different types or 3 different strongman exercises. You're seeing this incorporated more just to create some novelty. So one of the things that we talked about in the Coaching 345 class was the idea that you want to avoid monotony in the training. If they're coming in and they're squatting every day, or they're squatting twice a week, every week for all 4 years of their athletic career, that gets a little boring. And so, if we can do other things like this that challenge or resist hip and knee extension, but in a slightly different way, then maybe that'll help maintain some interest and break up the monotony of the training program. So that's really the utility of a lot of the strongman training stuff. All right, so tire flipping. So one of the things about tire flipping, one of the ways to think about it is it's pretty similar to a movement like a power clean. Because ultimately what you're doing is you are extending the hips, knees, and ankles. You're trying to get that triple extension to flip that thing over. Now, rather than pulling it to you as you do with the Olympic lifts, you're actually trying to kind of lean over it and push it. So you're simultaneously lifting and pushing at the same time. But from the standpoint of the hips, knees, and ankles, the movement is pretty similar. So basically you kind of explode up with it and then flip your hands over and then push it over is the general movement. Now there are other positions that you can use, as you can see there. So you can use like a sumo position. You can start with your shoulders against the tire, but in general and from an athletic standpoint, the most crossover to things that we would want the athletes to be able to do is the position that this guy's in, where it's similar to a clean. So the book goes through 3 common flaws. One of the things that the athletes tend to do is to put their feet like right up next to the tire. And so then in order to get their hands underneath it, they have to like really flex in the mid back and low back. And so obviously that is potentially injurious. So just be aware of their foot position. You may have to have them back up a little bit. Another one is that their hips come up faster than their shoulders. And you see that with deadlift too. And so you just want to have them focus on, keeping a big chest, keep their butt down. Can't really use mirrors because you're probably not going to be inside, but mirrors are something that's really helpful for that if you're teaching the deadlift. And then the other thing is that sometimes athletes will just like lift straight up like they're doing a deadlift rather than kind of like up and forward, because we want them to, again, as they extend, he's going to be kind of pushing this way so the tire will flip over. If they're just lifting up, they're not going to be able to flip it over, and so then that can be injurious as well. Logs, I've seen logs in like powerlifting gyms and strongman gyms and stuff like that, but I haven't really seen a ton of log lifting done in an athletic context, but maybe I'm out of the loop. But log lifting is similar to power cleaning, but a little bit different. So you can see Zydrunas here, the motion on log lifting is very similar to what we see with lifting stones, if you're into that. Essentially what they do is they get it up to just above their knees and then they squat down with it. It's called lapping it. And so that's what Zydrunas is doing there. He's actually just coming out of lapping it. So they'll put it on their lap and they'll squat down a little bit and then they'll stand up and kind of extend their hips and kind of throw their hips, if you will, kind of like one does during like a hang clean. And when they do that, the log is going to come up and essentially they like roll the log up their body. So they abduct their shoulders and then they externally rotate them to get the log up to their chest. And then once it's on their chest, they're going to squat down and push it overhead like you do with a standard push jerk of the barbell. The grip is a little bit different. Typically the grips here are a neutral grip. So the thumbs are up rather than both hands being pronated like you would see in a typical clean. Not a lot of research on the effectiveness of these. Again, this would be something where what you're doing with that thing is pretty easily trained with a barbell. And there's not a lot of need for athletes to lap things, like I said, where they pick it up above their knees and then they squat down. But I guess, like I said, if you wanted some variability, this might be useful. There are, and the book mentions this a little bit, you'll also see logs that are filled with water to do different proprioceptive stuff. So like the guy, I don't know, I think he's retired now, but the strength coach who used to be at Air Force, particularly in the early 2000s, he was huge on doing water logs. And so what the athletes would do is to do, like lunges and squats and stuff like that. And so they were very proprioceptive. They weren't particularly heavy, but you had to be very balanced so that the water didn't slosh around, you didn't fall over. And so real challenge to the stabilizing muscles, real challenge, both in the lower body and in the core. But there's not a ton of evidence that improves performance either, but it certainly would be incredibly difficult. So you'll see like fluid-filled logs as well. But those aren't a strongman thing. And then farmer's walk is another popular one. So you're just holding something heavy. It doesn't have to be logs like they're lifting there at last year's World's Strongest Man. It can be, they do make special handles for those. So for example, my early picture here. So these are ones sold by Rogue, so you'll see these. But you don't have to use something like that. Like you can just use dumbbells are pretty common, especially if you're working with high school and collegiate athletes. Oftentimes dumbbells will be enough, maybe not for your big offensive linemen and defensive linemen in football, but for a lot of the rest of your athletes, if you want to do farmer's walk, big dumbbells will work just fine. But what they do is they challenge that isometric grip strength, and if you walk a really long ways, it's going to be a special kind of burn in your traps, in your shoulders, in your back. It's a pretty uncomfortable event, but they are good for improving grip strength as well, which may be important in your sport. So if you're thinking about somebody like baseball players, that grip strength is important for their throwing velocity. Same thing with softball players, tennis athletes, etc. If they want to improve their grip strength, this is one of the ways that they can do it that's a little more novel than just doing like wrist curls or grabbing rice or whatever it is that they often do. Kettlebells, see kettlebells everywhere. So kettlebells, one of the things about them is they are really versatile. You can do all kinds of things, and you can do basically circuits with them. So you may go from like a kettlebell clean to a squat with the weight on just one side to immediately into a swing to a drop lunge. Like there's some really interesting circuits that you can put together with kettlebells. And so with that, you can get some cardiovascular training as well. But essentially, the authors of this chapter point out that the strength gains that you're going to see are not equivalent to what you would see with traditional barbell dumbbell kind of training, because the kettlebells just aren't as heavy. And so you're not imposing as much of an overload from that standpoint. And if you're going for a cardiovascular workout, traditional running or other types of cardio are actually more effective at improving lactate threshold or aerobic capacity. But kettlebells are pretty interesting. Like I said, they're very versatile. And they do offer some of that unbalanced training if you're into that. Like I said, like one of the more interesting exercises I've found of late is to just hold a kettlebell like at your shoulder on one side and then do squats that way. That provides a really interesting stimulus as opposed to just doing like back squats or front squats or normal barbell stuff. So they're useful in that way. And then there's obviously different kinds of kettlebells. So all that matters here is that there are some really cheesy ones. The ones that you could buy at like Target are not really made for athletic purposes. They're also really small. And kettlebells are pretty expensive. I mean, they're just a big chunk of metal with a handle. But given that, they're surprisingly expensive if you've ever purchased them. But, ones like this, so this is an adjustable kettlebell, which I guess is okay for somebody, training at home. So, going back to the COVID stuff, if you're stuck at home and you're doing a bunch of body weight training, this kind of adjustable kettlebell is a good way to add some resistance and add some novelty to that. But if you're actually training athletes, you want more of the fixed kind of kettlebell, even though they're more expensive, because they're also more durable. Athletes will drop them. That's actually the biggest thing. They drop them or they lose their grip. And so something like this would break. And lastly, unilateral training. So just training one side or the other. We've talked about bilateral deficit before, which is the idea that and you see this in untrained populations, if they do like a one-legged leg press on the right side and the left side, and then they do a bilateral leg press, that in untrained people, the addition, if you add up what they got on the right and what they got on the left to what they can actually do in a bilateral leg press, their unilateral score is actually, like their combined unilateral score is actually higher. But with more trained athletes, it actually goes the other way. So they are stronger in bilateral movements than they are in unilateral movements. But what you can use bilateral training for, oftentimes people will have a deficit on one side or the other. Their dominant leg, typically their right leg, can be stronger than the left. And so maybe we need to do some isolated work on the left side, left glute exercises to balance it out with the right side so that they don't have a possibly injurious running gait or something like that. All right, so that's the end of chapter 16. Those are all of the alternative training modalities. And as mentioned, as with chapter 15, and as you're going to see again with, I think, chapter 18, there's a pretty lengthy set of pictures and diagrams and example exercises. So one of the things that you could do is to try to incorporate those into your training program that's due at the end of the semester. So just something that's worth your time would be to look through those. And then, like I said, this is the last of the new information for this week, so good luck on this week's test. or not test, quiz. Good luck on this week's quiz.